right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for spending your Thursday with me. I love working with intentional productivity, but since 2018, I've been working with college students directly on understanding the ethics of AI. So my background is as a computer science teacher. I've taught computer science in 6th through 12th grade and at the college level at the University of Maryland. And this has allowed me to be facilitating these conversations with students both before the onset of mass use of generative AI through now, right? Where we are seeing ChatGPT and Claude inundate virtually every aspect of our day to day. And so I think this is a really important conversation to be having with college students, and particularly with students who are leading student organizations. So we're going to launch right into it. And what I wanted to start with is telling you the story of Amazon, and specifically the story of Amazon in 2014. So back in 2014, Amazon decided that they were going to bring fairness and equity into their hiring programs. And the way they were going to do this is that they were going to build a private AI tool that would review resumes and return the top 5 candidates automatically. And it would surface the top candidates based on qualities that previous successful Amazon engineers had encompassed. So they spent all of this time, a team of engineers in Scotland spent all of this time developing this tool that would create a, curated pool of applicants. And within a year, they had actually decided that they were not going to use the tool anymore. Does anybody have a guess as to why? Maybe you know the story. Give you a few seconds. So what Amazon didn't anticipate is that the tool did exactly what it was trained to do, which is select qualified applicants. Except the tool was also inadvertently trained to prefer male candidates. And the reason was because of the pool of data that Amazon used in order to build this tool. So to build this tool, Amazon used 10 years of resumes that had been submitted to Amazon and were categorized based on whether or not they had successfully been hired as an engineer, and then whether or not they had been successful in their tenure at Amazon. The reality, and most people know this, is that the tech industry skews male. So not only did most resumes come from men, meaning that we have fewer female resumes in the pool, but more successful candidates were male solely because of the pool itself. And AI learned those patterns. So the patterns that AI learned were that women weren't necessarily as qualified for those jobs. And the way that this turned out in the AI is it started penalizing resumes with the word women's, or with people who had degrees from all women's colleges, or looking for specific terms that men preferred over women, right? So men maybe were more likely to use terms like executed or captured, whereas women may have prioritized those softer skills. And so eventually, what Amazon realized is that while they had built this tool to make our pool more fair, more balanced, the actual result was that they had built a tool that discriminated against women, and they ended up shutting down the project entirely. Okay. Now, this is high level. We're looking at what's happening when big companies are using AI, but the reality is that this is a situation where Amazon had the best engineers in the business. They had unlimited resources. They had years of work. They understood how AI worked, and they still built a tool that was discriminatory, right? And our students are using AI in their everyday life that have been built on similar principles, right? Where, again, this was not intentional, but the outcome unfortunately still has a negative impact. And so it's really important for our students to be able to discern when they should be using tools, what may or may not be coming into the tools that they're using, and when they should or should not be using AI tools, especially in their work as leaders. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about some different ways that your students are using AI and how we can think about coaching them through using AI specifically in their education, and then also within their roles as leaders. So we'll start with a baseline. I'm just going to give you some of the tech behind how AI works. We'll then launch into some case studies. So I'm going to ask you to put yourself in the shoes of the student. I'm going to ask you to think about how these different case studies might also impact your role as an advisor. Then we're going to talk through how to create an AI code, which is an opportunity for students to step into their ethics, their organization's ethics, their school's ethics, and really think critically about when and how they use AI. And then we'll come back together, wrap it all up, and answer any questions that you might have. All right, so I would just love to know, you can let me know in the chat before we get into this. We know that students are already using these tools across their lives in many different ways. So I want to know, where do you see students using AI, and are they openly talking about it? You let me know in the chat what you're seeing, and we'll share out some. Yeah, homework for sure. And probably in lots of different ways, right? And I know when I used to teach an intro course, I would see students using it to summarize. I would see students using it in writing their essays. So lots of different ways. Yep. Programming ideas. Yeah. So maybe they're going there instead of thinking about what their members need, they're just outsourcing that initial thought process to ChatGPT. We can talk about why that's good or bad, and how it could be beneficial. Yeah. Seeing it in applications for awards, absolutely. I would guess too, if you were on any sort of conference committee, you would probably see so many conference submissions that look very similar, right? Instead of taking the time to fill out the application, they're outsourcing it. We're going to talk about a specific instance of this in a little bit as well. Yeah, coming up with team building ideas. So a lot of people are using Chat GPT or Claude or Gemini, whatever their preferred AI agent is, in order to, right, come up with ideas or outsource the work entirely. Yeah, chapter operations for fraternities and sororities. And we're going to look at something similar to that as well in a little bit. Great. All right, so let's talk about just the basics of artificial intelligence and make sure that we're all starting from the same place, which is, I like to think of AI, when I explain this to students, in concentric circles, okay? AI, artificial intelligence as a whole, is a broad definition for systems that mimic human thinking or perception, right? Exactly what the word says, artificial intelligence. So this could be ChatGPT. It could also be voice assistants. It could also be, if you're a millennial like me, right? You grew up playing computer games against computers, okay? And that would qualify as the broad definition of artificial intelligence, right? We have trained a computer to play a game. I like to think of this as AI being anything that is designed to sense, reason, or act like a human for a specific task or a collection of tasks, right? All right, so we go in a little bit in the circle and we have something called machine learning. Machine learning is a subset of artificial intelligence that learns patterns from data. So what that means, and this goes back to our Amazon example right at the very beginning, which is that we give AI data, and from that data, it picks up on patterns, okay? And so instead of us programming AI to do something specific, it looks at that data and then learns and analyzes what that data says, and it continues to improve over time with the more data that you give it, okay? Once we have machine learning, our next subset is called deep learning, which essentially sets up what's called a neural network. It mimics how the human brain works, right? So your human brain does pattern recognition, but actually it's way more complex than that, right? When your brain is working, it's not just looking at the data that's in front of it. It's looking at all of the different things that you know from every single area of your life, and it's drawing those connections, okay? Which is what allows us to process complex information, and it's what allows a computer to process complex information too. So deep learning, and you'll see here in a second, subset of deep learning being generative AI, which is like that ChatGPT or Claude, right? Says we have created a computer program that mimics a human brain, that's able to look at the totality of everything it knows, everything, all the data that's fed to it, and it can draw patterns, it can draw connections and create networks of that information. And like I said, what we're going to be talking about today, what people mean now when they say AI, is what is actually referred to as generative AI. It is this overarching category of tools like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, etc., that allows it to generate new text, images, content, etc., based on patterns that it's learned. So because we have this program that mimics a brain, we are able to generate content. We're able to create new things. Okay, generative AI, exactly what it sounds like. And this is where most of our students are thinking about AI, right? Because that's what's built in to their everyday, right? They have very easy access to whatever LLM they want, whether that's ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini. They may be interacting with AIs and AI algorithms in social media, which we're going to talk about in just a second here. This is where our students are having these conversations. And probably if you're using AI, this is where you're thinking about AI as well. All right, so we're gonna do a little pattern interrupt. I'm gonna give you some information about me. Okay, so before we look at how students are using AI to make decisions about others and about the work that they're doing, I want us to look at how AI is making decisions about us. Okay, so you may or may not be on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Spotify, etc. But whatever tool you're using is using an algorithm to predict what you want based on your behavior, and it builds a model of who you are. So I am going to give you my algorithms. All right, I pulled the first 3 videos that popped up when I opened up TikTok. I pulled my Spotify recommendations. I've got my Netflix suggested pieces, and then also my Amazon suggestions. So I would love to know, what does my algorithmic collage here, what does this tell you about me? Without knowing what do you know about me from my algorithms? And how do you know it? 'I'm a mom. Yep, you see the Play-Doh? How old do you think my children are? I've got a 3. Okay. Might be Swifty adjacent from the Spotify Rex. Okay. Health and wellness. We see B12, vitamins, protein powder. How old do you think I am? Or what generation, if you don't want to guess my age? I also already told you, but how old might I be? 32-ish. I love that. Thank you. Thank you. I will be 37 this weekend. So the Taylor Swift, I do like Taylor Swift, but the reason I like Taylor Swift so much is because I was also born in 1989. So everything Taylor Swift has ever created aligns with different patterns in my life. So I would say, yeah, very cool, right? I would say I like Taylor Swift, but a lot of it probably has to do with the timing. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so there's a few things that we can gather, right? And I think one of the other things I want to point out though is that even though we think we know me from what my algorithms tell you that there are pieces that maybe we're not considering, right? So, for example, my TikTok algorithm, that's all me, right? My Spotify algorithm, all me. I'm the only one who uses those 2 pieces, but I share both Netflix and Amazon. So those 2 are not as exact, partially because they're not just based off of me, they're based off of the people in my household. So, for example, right, this focus on health and wellness, I am focused on health and wellness, but some of those recommendations are actually for my husband, right? So, my husband is definitely more of a gym rat, I would say, than I am. And so, I think the biggest takeaway here, right, and something for us to remember as we're going into these conversations is that our algorithms and AI in general infers from patterns and from behavior, right? In all of these cases, I didn't tell the algorithms what I wanted. It inferred what I wanted based on what I watched or how long I listened to a song or what my buying behavior was. And a lot of times it gets it right, right? Especially as we continue to use these tools. a lot of times it gets it right, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it boxes us in. And again, an important thing to take away, and this goes back to what we were talking about with Amazon, is that what the algorithm can tell you or what the algorithm can do is only as good as the data that it has, right? At the end of the day, AI doesn't know you, it predicts you. Every recommendation, response, or output is based on patterns. What AI does, especially when it generates new things, is it says, based on what I have seen, based on what you have given me, based on the bulk of knowledge that I'm looking at, this is probably what you want. This is probably what you're asking for, which is powerful, but also limited, right? Because if it doesn't have knowledge of other pieces of information, they're not going to be included, and also not neutral, right? Especially when we're talking about tools like ChatGPT, Claude, etc. Does anybody know what the data set is for those tools for ChatGPT? What is ChatGPT trained on? Yeah, it's trained on the internet, right? And the internet is not neutral. The internet has good places and bad places, and so it's really important to keep in mind that the patterns that AI has created come from somewhere, and they carry the biases of the data that they were trained on. Okay. All right. Would love to know in the chat, if you were a student and you're navigating classes, organizational responsibilities, and your personal life, what might feel confusing or unclear about when it's okay to use AI? What might be confusing or unclear? And I'll give you an example as you're kind of thinking about this. Something I always think about as an instructor is that if a student is taking 5 classes, it's very likely that they are balancing 5 different AI policies as they're navigating assignments. And some of those policies differ based on the assignments that students are working with, right? So an instructor, a professor might have a different policy as it relates to writing essays versus, um, you know, completing a smaller weekly task. Yeah, you don't want to be accused of cheating or plagiarism. Mm-hmm. Very scary. I've talked to a lot of students who are very nervous that they will write something and AI will, or some sort of checker will say it's AI, even though it was something that they wrote themselves. And that's a whole separate conversation because a lot of those checkers are not super accurate. But yes, they don't want to be accused of cheating or plagiarism. Yeah. Yeah. Mixed messaging in broader society. I love that about what's good or acceptable and what's bad. Yeah. Yep. If you don't tell me I can't do it, then I can, and it's not cheating. Yes, I love that. So we might be working from different perspectives of what's acceptable and what's not. And Molly, I love that you pulled this out because in all likelihood, it is generational, right? That the students, the younger people involved are assuming that it's okay if they have been told, if they haven't been told it's not okay. And the instructors and teachers are operating from this place of, well, obviously it's cheating. Why would you use it, right? Okay. And then unclear of whether to use for a cover letter. Yeah, or anything that they're doing. It's interesting. I have friends who are in the job search right now, right? And there's AI baked into all places of the job search. And so can you use it for a cover letter? Can you not? I don't know, right? All right, so we are going to transition. We're going to be talking through some case studies. I'm going to give you 3 different scenarios that your students might encounter. 2 that are student organization based, 1 that's more academic, and these are composites that are based on real situations that students might be navigating. So they're not specifics. I'm not looking at, a specific student organization and pulling something from real life. But they are patterns that I see and talk with, advisors and leaders about on a regular basis. The way that we'll do this is I will give you the case study. I'm going to ask you for your gut reaction, and then we'll talk through what makes it complicated. Okay, so here's our first case study. I want you to consider a student organization that has a selective application process. There's a member of that selection committee who wants to use AI to analyze resumes, social media profiles, and any recommendation forms to identify the strongest candidates and create a ranked list that they will then talk through as human beings, as a committee, and choose who they're going to select. They argue that it saves time, removes human bias, and makes the process more fair. The applications include personal essays, GPAs, involvement information, references, and their social media content. They're also going to feed that information in. In the chat, I want you to let me know, do you believe that this is an ethical use of AI? So this is yes, it depends, no, or you're not sure. Just a quick gut reaction. Got 2 quick no's. 3 no's. And if you said no, what's your biggest concern? There's several things we can talk about here, but if you had to say it in 1 or 2 words, what's the biggest concern with this particular scenario? Mm-hmm. Bias. Oh, good. Yeah, people could easily lie or misrepresent themselves on documents. Sure. People might be using AI to write their applications, right? We don't know. Mm. Yep, feeding personal information into an AI source without explicit permission. Yeah, lack of consent, for sure. Yeah, so let's talk through some of these. All right, so we know we looking at this, I think it's a really good example of a student having good intentions, right? They are thinking about this and they're like, wow, we have to review so much information. We're all really busy. We want to be fair. So in order to be the most fair, let's just feed this into AI. Okay, they want to remove bias. But we also know that if the organization has historically selected certain types of members, that the AI might learn different patterns, right? So if an organization has historically selected a certain type of person, AI is going to be looking for that person, okay? The other question, and somebody else brought this up, Molly brought this up, is did the applicant consent to their data being shared with AI, and does that matter, right? So most AI tools are you're uploading data. You yourself can always consent to uploading your own data. But if somebody's written maybe a really personal essay, or maybe their application has GPA information and it's attached to their name and their birthday and other identifying information, that AI company now owns that data, right? And somebody hasn't been able to consent to their data being used, right? And then finally, the question is, does this actually make the process more fair? What do you think? I think it actually makes the process more fair. Yeah, my gut instinct is no, right? It doesn't actually make the process more fair. It does give us a perception of fairness, right? It allows us to feel like we're creating a more fair process, but especially if we haven't necessarily been trained on how to prompt or how to feed in that information, or our information is inherently biased, then the AI is not going to necessarily select a fair group. It's going to select the patterns that you've given it, right? Another question, and I would love, yes, it doesn't remove human bias exactly. I would love to know your thoughts. What happens if a student comes to you and they maybe ask you if this is something they should do? So what support do you think might help a student think through the situation before they're in it? Right? Because here's what ends up happening, right? And I see this a lot with college students is they maybe have left something to the last minute or the almost last minute, and now they're kind of in a crisis. And so it's not necessarily that this is always what they would do, but the reason they have to save time, the reason they're looking to save time is because they don't have a lot of time left, right? So how can we help students think through this situation before they're in it? And what questions might they consider? One thing that I think about is you know your timeline, right? If you're advising students, you know your timeline, you know when like something like this where a selection process might be happening. And so how can we provide support in building a timeline or surfacing these ideas where a student might come to you and say, hey, I'm thinking about using AI in this process. And then we may be able to push some questions back to them, right? Yeah, I love this. How would you feel about your personal information being fed into an AI, adjusting the timeline to give them more time? What's most important? Yeah, of course, this idea of this AI does not know your organization, right? You know your organization, you know what your group is looking for. And so you're looking to welcome people into this group, you're looking to choose the most qualified people. Why would we want to outsource that to an AI? That is actually one of the most important functions of your organization, right? Bringing more students in. Yeah, I love that. And then I think this other piece is really important is what are ways that we could use AI that would help you in the process without pulling that sensitive data in, right? So it might be a situation a student might choose to do is they might feed the actual application. So not student data, right? They might say, let me give the application materials to Claude and ask Claude to help me design an equitable process, right? What might it look like for us to have an equitable selection process? How could we, like, let's look at our selection process. How could we actually streamline it? We're finding that it's taking a lot of time. What are some suggestions? How could we go ahead and streamline this and make it more effective, more efficient? And so there are ways to bring in AI if students want to do that, that don't involve giving up student data, that don't involve giving up kind of that ownership of a very important part of their process. So that situation was all about evaluating people. And this next one, I think, is going to feel routine, but raises some different questions. All right. So scenario number 2. Let's say organizations on your campus are required to submit detailed risk management plans for every event. And there is a specific organization on your campus that has an upcoming event that is off campus and allows alcohol for students who are of age. They plan to just have ChatGPT complete the paperwork based on their event description, and they say that it will save hours of work and look professional and thorough. What is your gut instinct? Is this fine? Does it depend? Is it problematic? Or you're genuinely not sure? Is this super problematic? Yes. That was my initial gut reaction too. But why? Why is it super problematic? And do you think your students would say the same thing? So I think one of the things that comes up, especially when we're thinking about paperwork, right? Which is something, let's be honest, I mean, we said this at the very beginning, a lot of people use AI to fill out paperwork because a lot of people, not just students looking at risk management, a lot of people see paperwork as just like red tape, right? Something that we have to do. Okay. And they don't necessarily understand that there is a purpose behind doing risk management paperwork, right? So the question I have is when we're thinking about this, what is the difference between having a risk management plan and creating the risk management plan? And some of you have already addressed this in the comments. Does this matter? And you have said yes, right? This matters. Okay. Because if risk management, if something requires risk management, a risk occurs, a situation occurs, the students haven't thought through that process, right? They're at this event at 10:30 p.m., 11 o'clock p.m., and something happens and they actually didn't do the paperwork. They haven't thought through what they would do in this crisis situation, right? I think the other piece here that is brought up is that there are specific insurance requirements, laws, and policies for different organizations, for schools, for cities that schools might be in, right? And so we want to make sure that whatever we're doing, um, we are actually thinking about the liability that's required, right? And this question of, does your organization's liability cover an AI generated plan? We don't know, right? Because there's a requirement for specific officers to create pieces of that risk management plan. And does an officer, if I'm the vice president of, standards, does it count if it's me feeding it into ChatGPT, or does it actually need to be me that has thought through that plan? Okay. Yeah. If a student used AI to generate this risk management plan, what could go wrong if something goes wrong at the event? Yeah, and we've talked about this, right? That they don't necessarily, right? They don't know what the plan says. They don't know what they're going to do because all they did was generate it and submit it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and again, more importantly, and this is something that I talk about with people all the time when it comes to AI, right? Is if you outsource something to AI, who is responsible if something goes wrong? And this is a case where something could definitely go wrong, right? I was a consultant for my sorority back right out of college. And I remember having this conversation. Obviously, this is way before generative AI, but I remember having this conversation all the time around what decisions will you make if you know that you can be held responsible if something goes wrong, right? And that's a really important conversation to have with students because they could be held responsible, right? And if they haven't created the plan, if they haven't talked through what's going to happen, they're way less likely to know what to do if and when something goes wrong, right? When students mentally walk through something, we know that they are thinking through the night. They're saying, what happens if somebody drinks too much? What happens if somebody has a medical emergency? What happens if somebody disappears, right? What will we do? How are we going to make sure that these things don't happen, that we create a situation where it's less likely that we encounter these risks, right? The other piece, and we kind of touched on this in the comments, right, is that AI, again, is pulling from patterns. So it's going to generate generic risk categories. It can't necessarily think through a specific event, a specific venue, a specific campus, your members, because it doesn't necessarily have that data. And as we already talked about, we don't necessarily want to feed it that data, right? We don't have consent to feed member data. And so what AI is doing is generating some generic risk considerations. And if you've ever used AI for any sort of like brainstorming, you know this. AI will give you a list of like 5 to 10 different, very generic ideas. And then you kind of have to go through and think through it. And we want to make sure that students are doing that, right? If you are using AI for anything related to your organization, that there's some part of you that is also kind of doing that once over that path through, right? All right. And then the last question I have is, okay, we've all kind of agreed that this is not a great use of AI. It's a very problematic use of AI. We're concerned about what it could mean for student well-being. What are some ways that you can ensure that students understand the why behind a plan versus just this is something we have to do because it's required by the organization? What are some ways that we can focus on the why to hopefully help students see that there's value in them doing it and not just outsourcing it to ChatGPT? Yeah, something I think about is when we have people step into these roles, right? The students that you're working with that are filling out this paperwork. What are we doing when they step into those roles to talk about it, right? To talk about, these are the different pieces of your job. Here's why we do each of these things. What concerns do you have, right? Being honest with them, right? Like yes, it's very unlikely that something catastrophic will happen at an event that you're hosting, but it's possible. Something I always used to tell students that I was working with, right, was somebody could slip and fall. I went to school at the University of Georgia. We had one of our favorite places to host social events was it was a downstairs bar, right? And I was like, somebody could show up and slip down those stairs. They're at your event. That is totally out of your control. There's nothing you could have done to prevent it. And it still could be a major situation, right? Somebody could leave your event and then have something happen to them on the way home, right? Again, nothing you did necessarily, but something we need to think through and plan for and manage that risk as best as we can. Yeah. You're being looked at for guidance and support, and it's critical to be prepared. Yes. All right. If you had a student come to you and say that they were thinking about using AI for something like this, what is one question that you would want student leaders asking themselves before choosing to use AI? I mean, in this situation, but really any situation like this. I love that. How can I make sure AI is taking our internal policies and requirements into account? Yeah. Or what will happen if it doesn't, right? All right, we're going to look at one last case study. And I think this one is a little bit, we might be a little bit divided on this. Okay. Let's say a student has been assigned 50 pages of reading for a class. They're also working 10 hours a week. They're serving as a leader in their organization. They're taking 15 units and they're caring for a younger sibling. It's 1 a.m. the night before class and they're exhausted. They're considering having AI summarize the readings so that they can participate in tomorrow's discussion without failing the class, falling further behind, or losing more sleep. This class has no stated AI policy. I want to know, would you would you use AI to summarize the reading if you were in this situation? Be a yes. I love this scenario because I think this is a true gray area, right? I think a lot of people, if we're asked about AI generating essays or generating projects, more people fall into this category of that feels like cheating, but this maybe doesn't, right? Summarizing reading maybe doesn't. Yeah. Yeah. So we're on both sides here, right? So some things to think about. Okay. What is the purpose of the assignment? So is this reading is this, something that's supporting things that they were doing in class? Or is it something that's intended to teach them information that is completely separate, right, from what they're learning in class? Is the purpose of the assignment for them to prepare for a discussion, right? Do they actually need to pull specific text citations, right? So how we might use it might dictate whether or not we feel okay asking AI to summarize it. Another question I might ask with this is what happens if everyone in class does the same thing, right? So if we're in a 15-person discussion and we're going to get together and use, one of our discussion sections to talk about this reading, and everybody in class uses ChatGPT to generate a summary, and we all have the same summary, what are we missing, right? And maybe we're not, right? Maybe the purpose of the reading again is to supplement what you're already learning in class. And so it really doesn't matter if we all do it because we're not doing anything with what we learn from the reading. The next question is, what habits are we building? Right? So this is something that I talk about a lot with people when it comes to AI, is that we really want to think about when we're using AI, are we outsourcing the thinking or are we using it to help us think better, right? Are you okay with using AI to summarize all of your reading? And if not, what habits or check-ins can we put in place to make sure that we don't use it all the time if that's not something that we want to do? And like I said, I think this is a little bit more gray area. And Molly pointed out, this is a great point, that people have different beliefs. And we'll talk about this in a second. We're going to talk about building a code of ethics around AI. We all have different beliefs around this, and there's no judgment there, right? It's just understanding and checking in with yourself and finding out what is it that you believe and what feels good to you, right? And then I think the last thing that I think is important for advisors, for professors to consider is that this student is not lazy. I think there's a categorization that students using AI to summarize reading or to help them outline papers or whatnot, that they're just lazy. They're not lazy, they're overwhelmed, right? When I look at that case study, that student is not a lazy student. They have a lot going on. They maybe push something to the last minute, but what is the actual issue and what can we do to support that student, right? Yeah, I think it feels similar to Spark Notes. Definitely the reading piece, right? Feels similar to Spark Notes. And again, I think that's a great point. And I feel like I was in high school when that happened. I remember the high school conversations around Spark Notes, and my teachers had lots of different opinions on that too, right? People were on either side, and I think it depended on the class. So important to keep in mind, right? And again, we're going to talk about creating a code of ethics and helping students think through what they believe around AI usage. But it's really important that students have a sense of what their values are and what they believe and how they want to use it before it's 1 o'clock in the morning and they're exhausted and they're low on time, right? Because we might make different decisions in different situations. And so having some clarity around what your values are, around what you believe is ethical use or unethical use, allows you to make informed, empowered decisions rather than being in a place of reaction. Beyond those three scenarios, are there other ethical gray areas that you think your students are navigating that impact their AI use? So AI related scenarios that students feel kind of gray on. Writing constitutions and bylaws? Totally. Yeah, I talk about this a lot with, I was talking about this a few weeks ago with a national organization, and this question came up of what are we comfortable sharing with ChatGPT, right? Um, a lot of organization documents, constitution, bylaws, etc., are behind a password. You have to have a password to be able to go in and access those tools. Is it then okay to share it with ChatGPT, right? Yep. They can't use AI for chapter business, but what does that mean? Yes. Yeah. So some other things that I want to surface that academic integrity expectations vary wildly. We talked about this before, that professors, instructors, organizations all have different interpretations of what academic integrity looks like. And that can even vary based on assignment, right? So what is okay for homework in one class might not be okay for the final paper, right? And then on top of that, they're navigating multiple different classes. Students have an overwhelming pressure to be efficient and productive in every area of their life. This is just, they are overwhelmed. They feel a lot of pressure. They want to be good, right? There's a sense that they are at a disadvantage if they don't use it. If they know that every other student in the class is using AI and they're not going to use it, are they at a disadvantage because they're not using it to speed up their process or speed up their thinking or go deeper or whatever that is? There isn't a clear definition of what's okay or what's not. I think we talked about this at the very beginning, right? There's a difference in opinion about what is good or okay and what is not generationally, could just be person to person. We don't necessarily have this shared understanding. And then ultimately, they want to do good work. They want to be a good student. They want to be a good leader. But the world right now is completely overwhelming, right? There's a lot going on. They are dealing with a lot in their internal lives, but also within the context of everything going on in the world. Okay. So they have a lot going on and they're trying to figure out, how do I do good work? How am I good in every area of my life? Okay. So there's a lot of pressure. And so I think one of the really important things that we need to bring into these conversations with students is that AI use is not inevitable. There is a sense, and I see it not just from students, I see it from adults too. There is a sense that AI is inevitable. Oh, you just have to get on board. Get on board. You need to use it in everything, because if you don't, the world is going to move on without you. And I think that we need to push back against this and empower students to understand that they have more agency than they think, right? That even though they have all of these AI tools at their disposal, they get a choice. They get to decide how, when, and whether or not they use AI. And that, especially in the context of leadership, in the context of how they're working in student organizations, that their choices also impact their members, and it sets organizational culture, right? So not only do they have agency in their own AI use, but they also have agency as an organization, as a leadership team, to decide how and when they're going to use AI. The other thing I want to point out here, and I think this goes back a little bit to that SparkNotes conversation, is that a lot of people, when they talk about AI, are either we need to ban it and not use it, or we just need to use it for everything. And I would argue that the true answer for most people is somewhere in the middle, right? The goal isn't to say, I'm never using AI again, necessarily. You might say that, or to say, I'm going to use it forever for everything. But that for most people, the goal is to make conscious choices that align with their values as leaders, students, and people, right? All of the scenarios that we just talked about are could be interpreted differently based on what your values are, but also what the values are of the organization. And again, the goal here is conscious choices, meaning it's much harder to make an informed decision, to think through, what do I actually want to do, if we haven't thought about it before, right? If we use AI to fill out the risk management paperwork, and then we find ourselves in a situation where the risk wasn't managed and we don't know what to do, now we're reacting, we're in a reactionary place, right? So what I love to encourage students to do, and I started doing this with my college students, and now teach students and educators to do this everywhere, is to create a personal and organizational AI code. It's not a policy from an administration, it's a code that aligns with what their values are and what the values of the organization are, right? So first, we're clarifying their position as a leader. What do you believe as the leader of the organization, and what is going to inform your decisions in advance? It allows them to make consistent decisions even under pressure, right? Even when it's 1 a.m. and they have 50 pages of reading, they have clarity around what their values are, and those values can inform that decision. It helps them to guide their members, right? So, of course, we want to make sure that we're, leading organizationally, but they're also leading a group of their peers who are also navigating how and when to use AI. And so if the student leaders understand how to create an AI code of ethics and they've gone through that process, they can support their peers as well. And ultimately, when we create this, when we say this is our code of ethics around AI as an organization, we are saying this is us. This is who we are. This is how we operate. This is an extension of our organization's values, right? This is just a new frontier, right? Is what they say. It's a new frontier. It's a new way to apply the values that your organization has had for years, whether that's 10 years, 50 years, or 250 years. So when I think about an organizational AI code, I think there are two parts. The first is our commitments. What do we commit to when we're working with members? And the second is, what do we ask of our members? What are the expectations for AI use when we're working on things together as an organization, right? I'm going to go ahead and share my AI code. So this is what I share whenever I am working with students or I'm working with educators. My AI code, again, is mine. Yours would look different, but here's what I come up with. So I look at AI as a helpful brainstorming partner, but I would never use it for a final product. I never use AI for something I can Google. I never share data that isn't my own. I disclose AI usage when I'm submitting something. I never use AI for creative work. I never use AI for something that I can't do manually. This one I think is really important. I would never ask AI to do something that I don't know how to do because then I can't check the output, right? If I've never done it, how will I know if the output is good? And then my most important belief around AI is human last. Human last means that a human being is always reviewing and taking responsibility for that final output, right? Even if I'm asking AI to support me with something, generate something, whatever I turn in, use, etc., my eyes have gone over human last. We might have students create that for themselves or for the organization. And then we also will ask them to articulate what they expect from members. So some examples that I've seen students use: being honest with other members around how you're using AI in shared work, never uploading other members' personal information or work to AI tools without consent, keeping conversations about member conflicts or concerns out of AI tools. If you are the vice president of standards for your organization, you are not going to AI and saying, Sarah did XYZ. How would you handle this? Right? That's not necessarily feeding in data that people have given you, but it's still a personal scenario. Using AI to support your learning, not as a replacement, and following AI guidelines from your professors, schools, organizations, etc., or when in doubt, ask. Right? All right. The last thing I'm going to ask you to do is put yourself in the shoes of your students. What is one commitment that you would want your organization to make about AI use? So you just experienced kind of this idea of surfacing values, discussing what matters, articulating commitments. That's what we should be facilitating with our students, getting them to think critically before the moment arises, right? Before it's necessary. If you were a student, what's something that you would want your organization to commit to? When I think about this, I think about professional organizations that I'm a part of. Um, and I think about, let's say they're using information to, choose awards or choose scholarships or choose positions, right? Who's going to be leading certain organizations. I would expect my organization to not use AI for those selections, right? Not sharing data on other platforms, not using tools to replace responsibility. Yeah. All right. So as we close out our time together, and I'm going to stick around for any questions, but I just want to leave you with four big takeaways. The first is that AI is not neutral. It feels neutral because it's a computer generating information, but it's not neutral. It carries biases from training data and from the programming. Using AI is always an ethical decision, right? And this is not me saying it's ethical or not, but there are always benefits and trade-offs that come with AI usage. And we need to be considering those things. Your students might find that the benefits outweigh the trade-offs a lot of the times, and they may find there are situations where they don't necessarily. Another thing to keep in mind is that data shared with AI might be permanent, right? Once it's in the system, we can't take it back. And so it makes it even more important to be careful with other people's information, especially if you don't have consent to share it in that way. And then finally, students have way more agency than they think. They live in a world that tells them that AI is here, it's here to stay, but ultimately how they use it, when they use it, and how much they use it is up to them. Our values should drive those choices we make technologically, and empowering your students to think through this before they're in a situation where they feel like they have to use it allows them to be empowered as leaders. As you leave today, I want you to think about a conscious AI conversation that you could have with your students before the end of the year. Not telling them exactly how to think, but how can we empower them to make their own choices, think through these processes themselves. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you are leaving thinking more about what conscious AI looks like. If you want to bring this program to your campus, I would love to talk with you. And I'm happy to take any questions that you have about anything we covered today or about AI in general. Thank you so much.